Greetings! Today we are going to start actually talking about the pirates. Luckily this time around I don't really need much of a disclaimer. This video is going to be pretty tame. The next one, it's going to get pretty awful. I do want to say that I was a little disappointed at how many comments were held for review on the last video. This is a history page. This is not your place to vent your weird conspiracies, your racism, etc. Pretty sure there's other outlets for you to do that. Do not confuse me honestly and frankly talking about history with supporting those kinds of beliefs and being okay with them on this channel. Maybe one day we can talk about my politics, but for now, no. Definitely not. Not on this channel. So, take care. I hope you enjoy. We left off with William III coming to the throne. There's a little bit that I kind of left out that needs to be discussed. Following the Franco-Dutch War in 1678, Louis XIV emerged as the most powerful monarch in Europe. The French military was the strongest military at the time. The French economy was booming. Everything was going good for Louis XIV. And he got it into his head to start making moves in Europe. Standing against him were the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs controlled the Holy Roman Empire as well as Spain. Spain was at this point starting to decline in power. But they were still an economic powerhouse. They still had a fairly strong military. England was, of course, going through its political issues, as it did through much of the 17th century. Under James II, they were trying to get a closer relationship with France. That said, that move was unpopular, largely due to religion, but also due to past history. When William III, then William of Orange, arrived in England with a Dutch force, he was welcomed. He was welcomed so much that James II pretty much ran away. William became William III in 1689. This is right at a year after the start of what would be called the 9 Years' War, sometimes King William's War, and also the War of the Grand Alliance. The Grand Alliance would come to include the Dutch Republic, England, Scotland, the Holy Roman Empire, the Duchy of Savoy, and Spain. Incorporating Spain into this alliance would lead to some awkward situations early on among the Buccaneers, who were still active in the Caribbean. The Buccaneers, of course, at this point had been used to fighting against Spain. Many of the colonial leaders were used to issuing letters of marque to protect them from the Spanish. Complicating things were the rise of the Jacobites. The Jacobites, of course, were those who still supported the Stuarts after they were removed. This would come up a lot more later on following the death of Queen Anne. But at this moment, yes, there were the Williamite Wars in Ireland, for instance. The pirates themselves do not seem to have been that political on that front. They do, however, seem to feel a little let down over the end of the war with Spain. It wasn't really a war, it was more of a proxy war through much of the 17th century that periodically heated up. Some of the Buccaneers that were still active included Dampier, Cook, Swan, Edward Davis. If you want to see some more videos about them, Golden Gunpowder has plenty of videos which cover especially Dampier and Swan. Which brings us to 1689 in the Caribbean. The English portion of a French privateer crew, these would have been filibusters and buccaneers, decided to mutiny against a Captain Jean Fantine. They renamed their ship the Blessed William. And either when they arrived in Nevis or before as a crew, either elected or appointed, a certain William Kidd was named captain. I'm going to save a lot of my criticism of Kidd until the video on Kidd, but I will say Kidd at this point was fairly experienced. He's noted to have been experienced. Experience does not necessarily equal leadership ability. Now, the governor of Nevis was unable to pay privateers. Why would you? You want them going after the French. Their first attack was against the island of Marie-Galante, and then the ship moved north into New England where they captured a French privateer. They returned to the Caribbean, and while Kidd was ashore in Antigua, his crew mutinied. Among them was a William Mays and a Robert Culliford. Both these names are going to come up continuously throughout this series at this point. The crew decided to elect William Mays, not to be confused with the William Mays of the Fancy, elected him to be captain. They moved north, again, this time to New York, where a Governor Jacob Leicester had taken control of the city. Jacob Leicester was working under the assumption that people loyal to James II were going to take the city, so he decided to take it instead. By 1691, he was executed for treason, but at this point he was still in power. One of his biggest contributions was setting up a French Huguenot settlement, which is now modern-day New Rochelle. If you ever want to visit a nice little museum, the Thomas Paine Cottage in New Rochelle not only has an amazing swivel gun, which I did a short video on, but they also have a tiny museum dedicated to the Huguenots. It's definitely worth a visit. Amazing site, amazing board, well worth the visit. Jacob Leicester grants them a letter of marque. They went north and attacked two French-Canadian towns and captured a large French ship, which was placed under the command of Culliford and renamed the Horn Frigate. They sent 2 ketches to New York with some of the prizes that they had acquired, and those 2 ketches were actually seized by French privateers. At this point, Culliford and Mays go back to New York. They end up leaving the French ship. A lot of times that they'd have a captured ship and they had a friendly port, they'd sometimes sell it. So more than likely, this is what happened. There's no mention of the Horn Frigate after this. They took the Jacob. They had renamed the Blessed William the Jacob, took that, and went out and captured another French vessel. At some point, William Mays decides to stay in New York. Culliford and several others, though, they take the Jacob and head toward the Indian Ocean. It is unsure exactly what prompted them at that moment to do so. However, it's very likely there were enough members of the crew that were familiar with the Indian Ocean that they decided they wanted to get a little bit larger of a prize than just some of the French privateers they've been dealing with. In 1692, Culliford, a James Gilliam, and a few others decided to attack India directly. This was using basically the buccaneer tactic of landing and actually fighting on the land. They were defeated. 18 of them, including Culliford and Gilliam, would spend the next 4 years in prison. Spoilers, they're going to come back into the story. Not this video, the next video. In 1688, in Philadelphia, a ship known as the Bachelor's Delight was sold to its crew. At this point, it had been under the captaincy of Edward Davis. Those of you who have watched Golden Gunpowder's videos should be familiar with Bachelor's Delight. It had a very long career among pirates and buccaneers. Davis, at this point, had gotten mixed up with the law down in Virginia. He ended up getting sent to London, where eventually the charges of piracy were dropped. A portion of his loot actually ended up founding William and Mary College, which is a public university in Williamsburg, Virginia. At this point, the new captain was Josiah Rainer, sometimes called George Rainer. In late 1691, the Bachelor's Delight appears at Adam Baldridge's trading post in Madagascar after having taken a Mughal ship. At this point, the crew either renamed the Bachelor's Delight the Loyal Jamaica, or they named the captured ship the Loyal Jamaica. There's differing reports. I am more inclined to believe that it was the Mughal ship. At this point, Josiah Rainer decides they are going to sail back with the Loyal Jamaica and leave the other ship in Madagascar. Among the crew at this point was a Richard Want, a name that will come up again later, and possibly a Thomas II. While doing the research for this video, I encountered some weird discrepancies in the historical documentation. I started looking around, and I came across a book by Matthew Frick, who's the curator at the Pirate Museum in St. Augustine. He's actually written a book called A Gold Chain, a Wooden Leg, and a Treasure Chest, The True Story of Thomas II. It's available on Amazon. Short read, a lot of decent information. He's of the theory that II was a part of the Bachelor's Delight. We're going to get into this when we get into II next. They sailed the Loyal Jamaica toward the American colonies. Along the way, they ended up capturing a ship belonging to a plantation owner by the name of Jonathan Amory. They ran the ship aground somewhere near Charlestown, modern-day Charleston, South Carolina, and agreed to give the governor the ship, the guns, possibly a portion of whatever loot they had acquired, and they were absolved of piracy. At this point, Richard Want and George Rainer settled down in the Carolinas. Another of the crew, a William Cotter, ended up going north to Maryland, where he married a Jane Gassaway. She was the daughter of Nicholas Gassaway, who was one of the wealthier members of Maryland society. Upon Nicholas's death, he inherited the Gresham estate, and in 1698 was arrested for piracy. But he was described as having good behavior as to any acts of piracy. Even though he admitted to it, they just didn't believe he was a pirate. In 1702, he died of natural causes, and his estate was left to his 4 children. The estate is still in existence today. Thomas II was either born in Northamptonshire, UK, or in Rhode Island. There is there's at least 3 possibilities on this. One hand, there's 2 families that could possibly be. The other, it wasn't his name, or it was a family that has been missed from the records. At either rate, he ended up in Newport, Rhode Island. He was married and had 2 daughters. According to one author who I spoke to, one of them was named Amity. which is going to become important shortly. In 1691, Tew moved to Bermuda. Well, I say moved, but more than likely he was looking for work. At this point, he was already considered a pirate. Now, the term pirate and privateer, they sometimes get used interchangeably in some of the documents at this time. But when he meets Richard once, and Richard once allegedly becomes his first mate, that's where Matthew Frick, and actually myself at this point, kind of lean to them having a prior friendship, possibly with the Bachelor's Delight. In 1692, they receive a letter of marque from the governor of Bermuda. At this point, Bermuda's governor is Isaac Richier. Isaac Richier is an interesting character. When I was looking up, I realized there wasn't much information on him in the immediate sources, so I had to start digging. Turns out the first word to describe Isaac Richier was a criminal. When he became governor, he ransacked the governor's mansion and just started selling random things. At various points, he's described as hanging out with known criminals, and with a later pirate, I've encountered documents where he was actually an interloper. In that specific case, he was going against the Royal Africa Company's monopoly, so he was trading in slaves. He ended up being arrested and replaced by a Governor Goddard. Goddard was described as being worse than Richier. The Attorney General at the time was Samuel Trott. When they were put on trial, he did not really trust the court and referred to the court as bush lawyers. And he too was imprisoned. To give you an idea of Goddard and Richier's skills with people, they decided to ask the Attorney General, who had been prosecuting them, how to escape from the jail. Trott naturally ratted them out, and they were sent to England. I encountered in one of the documents I posted a short on, I actually encountered where he's describing his prison conditions in a complaint to William III. At this point, though, Richier is governor. Matthew Frick has a copy of the letter of marque issued by Richier in his book. There's a lot of vagueness that could very easily be abused. With a lot of the letters of marque from the colonial governors, you encounter some of this. It's going to become very important later. At this point, Tew now has a ship. It's a sloop called the Amity. It was built and outfitted in Bermuda. He'd have a crew of 47 and approximately 6 guns. It's a small ship. It's not what we think of as this giant pirate ship. No, it's a small Bermuda sloop. His mission was to sail alongside another privateer, George Dew, who had a sloop called the Amy, with the goal of going to Gambia and raiding a French factory there. Again, with Richier being an interloper, more than likely their objective was to take slaves. At some point during the voyage, they encountered a storm. Dew was blown off course and lost his mast. He ended up drifting into modern-day South Africa, where he was arrested by the Dutch. For Tew, though, at some point, either before or after the storm, he met with his crew, among them Richard Want, and suggested becoming pirates. The crew naturally agreed. And that is when they started to sail toward the Indian Ocean. In In 1693, they arrived at the Strait of Babel Mansdeb. Babel Mansdeb is this narrow stretch, it's 18 miles across, between the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. Today, it's fairly near Somalia and is sometimes considered to be a risky zone today with pirates, not just in this time period. The story goes that they took on a ship with 300 soldiers and didn't lose a single man and captured a massive prize. I was never happy with that story. A lot of times when we're talking about Golden Age pirates, we are talking about basically disgruntled delivery drivers. When you're talking about buccaneers, you're talking about hardened soldiers. Some of them were adventurers, some of them were mercenaries, some of them had actually been professional soldiers and sailors. When I was trying to figure out how it's possible that 47 people in a small sloop defeated a ganja dhow with 300 soldiers. Keep in mind, in my previous videos, when I was talking about the Mughals, I was talking about their advancements in weaponry. They would have been roughly equivalent in ability and firepower to some of the colonial Spanish forces at that time. So, maybe not the best, but definitely not pushovers. So, as I see it, more than likely what occurred was, with prior intelligence of the area, so they knew where to be, likely because, as theorized, two may have been there before, at least one had been in the area before with the Bachelor's Delight. They more than likely waited near Perim, which is a small island in Babel Mansdeb, and they waited. They waited for the right moment to strike a passing ship. They would have come up behind it, just as buccaneers had done many times before with larger Spanish ships, and they would have used musketry. A Bermuda sloop does not need that many sailors to operate it. With 6 guns, you're only talking about 3 gun crews. They would have switched sides throughout. You had at least 20 or more other sailors being able to lay down suppressive fire. If they were buccaneers, they more than likely were a lot more accurate than some of the other soldiers at the time, and it would have made taking on this ganja dhow entirely possible. We do know for a fact that they did get substantial wealth. This comes from their activities in the colonies afterward. The Mughals, we know for a fact, would protect it no matter what. So I actually don't doubt the story. I just don't think it was as cut and dry as, we just took the ship. No, that's probably not what happened. There's a few authors have claimed they might have used torture. There seems to be no evidence to support this. That said, they were buccaneers. Buccaneers did employ torture to find out where things could be hidden. At this point, they return to Adam Baldridge's trading post. They try to sell off pretty much anything like silks, spices, things that they can't necessarily use themselves, and it's not hard currency. One of the best ways to think of Adam Baldridge's trading post, and actually some of the other ports at this time, they were very much like a, if you've ever been on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, a turnpike rest stop. So, to use a modern example, you might walk in and a soda that will cost you $2 in a grocery store will cost you $5 to $10 at the rest stop. Yes, Adam Baldridge did inflate a lot of prices. More than likely, he wouldn't have given them the full value of what things were worth. At any rate, in modern currency, The ganja dhow they took was worth approximately $16 million. Again, today's money. Each of the crew got between $200,000 and $500,000. And two walked away with about $1,400,000, again, in today's currency. Two actually wanted to go back out and take another ship. Richard Want, at this point, talked him down. They stayed at Adam Baldridge's trading post for a bit and careened the ship, even though it's a Bermuda sloop, so we're talking the pinnacle of technology at this time, the best wood, everything else. It still needed careened. In the general history of pirates, there's a claim that two apparently went off with a French captain mission, and they went and they fought slave ships, and they captured slaves and set them free, because in Madagascar, slaves were free because it was Libertalia. Of course, we all know that that story is, for the most part, false. Slaves would not have been freed in Madagascar, especially with Adam Baldridge's trading post. In actuality, 2 and half the crew, including Richard Want, returned to the American colonies. Around 23 of the crew remained on Madagascar. Two arrives in Providence, Rhode Island in 1694. At that point, Richard Want returns to the Carolinas. He's got his family there and everything else. They do their best to distribute the funds to everybody who had invested. I mean, it was still a privateering mission. Two at this point is wealthy. There's a lot of discussion over whether or not he might have been wealthy before all this. I might end up doing a follow-up video on Two. At this point, Two meets Benjamin Fletcher, who is now governor of New York. Fletcher would be governor from 1692 until 1697. In 1693, he briefly was governor of Pennsylvania during the point in time where William III was trying to figure out if he could trust Markham. So, 1692, Markham's replaced. 1694, Markham comes back. Truth of it was, William III probably shouldn't have trusted either of them. Fletcher is noted to have granted commissions to everyone. Apparently, he was very well aware of what Phillips was up to with his slave trade with Adam Baldridge. Fletcher becomes the bane of the existence of Edward Randolph, who was the Surveyor General of Customs. Randolph's job was to enforce the Navigation Acts. He was to enforce the monopolies. And apparently Fletcher made this very difficult for him. Lord Bellamont, who would be Fletcher's successor, describes Two's meeting with him as such. He had brought his spoil to Rhode Island, and his crew dispersed in Boston, where they showed themselves publicly. In 1694 or 1695, Two came to New York, where Governor Fletcher entertained him about in his coach, though Two publicly declared that he would make another voyage to the Red Sea and make New York his port of return. Now, allegedly, Two was basically brandishing his wealth. He had gold chains, things like that. When you think about this successful pirate, Two really fits that description based on the time period. Two was one of the first of this generation of pirates to really make a name for himself. You got to think, England at this point, war, they had had quite a few of embarrassments throughout the 17th century. I mean, you had the English Civil War, you had Charles II constantly fighting the Dutch and failing. They needed this working class hero. And right now, at this moment, the popular press was booming with all these different stories of some of these figures. even if they were pirates, they were still, they're bringing this back to us. They're like Robin Hood. 2, of course, will make another voyage to the Red Sea. We're going to conclude this video, though, on the 7th of May, 1694. There's a ship called the Charles II laying at anchor in La Coruña Harbor in Spain. If you enjoyed today's video, please like, subscribe, and share. We're trying to get monetized. There's been a lot going on, which is why this video has been a little bit delayed being released. I might do a post about it at some point. Those who know, you know. Hopefully we get a lot more going on as we head into the fall with more events, things like that. Also, interviews. The next few videos we're going to be talking definitely about Henry Every and his crew. I think they're called the crew of the Prancy. Not sure. And definitely gonna have a very strongly worded video on a certain William Kidd. I know a lot of Golden Gunpowder did an excellent video on like his background and everything that he did or didn't do. I might make the video on Kidd a little bit more of a criticism of some of the works that have been written about Kidd, some of the money-making schemes that have been made based upon his alleged treasure. There's been quite a few historians that have done great things but have gotten sucked into the Kidd saga. Kidd historically had a way of destroying those around him. So, definitely not going to be a fun video. I mean, it might be fun for you. People tend to enjoy whenever I get into a rant. So, take care. Have an excellent day.